Thank you very much, Dr. Branson. It's a great pleasure to have the chance to speak to you all this morning. I'm a Society for Economic Botany conference virgin, like so many of you. So I was a little nervous this morning, listening to all these very sophisticated talks and creative talks this morning. I have not so much a presentation, a paper to give, but more of a slideshow, which I'll just chat to, because that's my story. That's all I can do, is present the story that I've worked on for the last 20 years. Those last few comments about that interface between academe and people is something I've always been very interested in. I spent many years in university. My story begins before thatching, before I got involved in this. They certainly didn't have thatched roofs in my little Ontario village in Canada. We grew wheat, but it was only about so high, and you'd never be able to thatch with it. And the concept of putting it on a roof was only in storybooks like the Three Little Pigs, really. But the fact that you can have a thatched roof that lasts for 50 years, made out of very insubstantial materials like straws, is I think really quite interesting. But my interest in uses of plants and all this predate that. It goes back to when I had the incredible luck and pleasure of studying at UCL with Gordon Hillman and David Harris, which I know many of you probably know a lot about. And he really turned me on to wheat and domestication of cereals, and the wider concept of archaeobotany. So all those lists on that description of my life, where it says archaeobotanist, farmer, plant breeder, master thatcher, master baker, I love it. I love it. That's about 5 lifetimes worth of skills, I think. So I mean, I have spent the last 15 years on roofs, a great part of it. So I like to call myself a thatcher, but a master thatcher to me, in respect to colleagues and friends who really are masters, who've done 4-year apprenticeships and spent 10, 15 years working in the field actively every day on a roof. That's a master. I am the classic maybe jack of all trades, or some trades, and master of very few. And in the same way, as a master baker, I did work as a professional baker a long time ago, but and I do bake a lot now, and I can make a reasonably good loaf, but I don't consider myself a master baker either. But I'll accept the term archaeobotanist, and I'll accept the term farmer. And plant breeder, if I can nudge the edges of that and refer to kind of evolutionary plant breeding rather than the regimented way in which I think it's been done. That's blabbering. I hope I can, if I just click. So I have a slideshow I'll run through. And my story, I just have to run through how it started for me. But I'd like to think that by the end we'll get on to bread, heritage cereals a bit more. When I refer to heritage cereals, to me, when I work with the Eurasian cereals, wheat, rye, barley, and oats. I know there's quinoa and amaranth and any number of other heritage grains. And every time I go back to Canada, I go to the shops and I see heritage cereals products sprouting up everywhere. I think North America is a little bit more advanced in that sense than what's happening here, but we're definitely having a revolution in baking, a revolution in food going on in Britain, which I'm trying to contribute to. So, as I said, to go back to the beginning, I had no idea about thatching. I mean, the thought of, like I said, living under thatch, I certainly didn't realize. And I was working at the University Museum in Oxford, the Museum of Natural History in Oxford, as it's now called, after I finished my MSc. And I was sitting at my bench, analyzing charred seeds from medieval archaeological sites, wheat, barley, oats, rye, maybe, if you can identify it properly. And a colleague walked in with a shoebox full of thatch of old ears of wheat that he claimed was 600 years old from a medieval roof. But we didn't really believe it, because the thought of, I never really thought of it, but the thought that you put thatch on a roof, I thought it was decay after 20 or 30 years, and you strip it all off and then put a new layer on. That's the logical way, and that's how it's done in most of the world, Eastern Europe and many places. But there's a peculiar tradition in Britain where you don't do that. You just, when the layer you put on starts to decay, you just put another one over it, and so on, and so on, and so on, for 600 years. So the original base coat that was applied when these roofs were built is intact. And it's never been, there's no reason to replace it. I think it's just laziness. Perhaps you don't want to take it all off. But it had this wonderful insulation, for one thing. So you build up these chronologies of semi-decayed thatch. And the good thing is that the ears, of course, are surviving up on the roof. So these are pretty traditional looking thatch boxes that you see. So I'm still in that conversion from slide to PowerPoint, so some of the slides may not be up to your standards. In any case, the roofs on these buildings are all about 4 foot thick of straw. So, and that hides about 10 layers of thatch at various points in there. And like I say, the bottom layer is medieval. The one on the bottom right, we have rethatched, but I have a history of this building going back, well, certainly to the origins of photographs. The building in the top right, the core of that building dates back to about 1250 AD. So the ancient thatch that survived in the base coat is practically Norman thatch, Norman cereals, a snapshot of the medieval field. And in that case, it's barley, so it's Norman beer making waste, really, malting waste. And so on for the other buildings, 1450, about 1500, and they're all dated to that late medieval period, and I'm particularly interested in that period anyway. Now, this is how all these buildings were open hall buildings, meaning they didn't have chimneys. They have chimneys now in those photos you've seen, but you can picture this room as an open hall building, a little bit big for it, but the same concept. They didn't have chimneys. They had an open fire in the middle of the hall, and the smoke just trickled up into the roof space like this. And if this roof was thatched, you'd see the thatch. It would be covered with soot. After 100, 150 years of smoke going up there, the rafters and everything is covered by soot. There wasn't a first floor. So later on, in the late 1500s, there was a great fashion to insert a first floor, so you could have an upstairs, and a ceiling above that. And then at the same time you build the chimney, obviously it would be a little bit difficult to live upstairs. So that stopped all that smoke blackening. So now you can crawl up into the roof space, and that's what you find. So that's above the ceiling on the first floor, and what you see is heavily blackened timbers of the original roof that was built in 1450. I mean, that's a botanical treasure trove as it is, just looking at the vines, the bonds on it. There's clematis and blackberry stems and hazel and willow and you name it, because you're tying down that base coast as an anchor and then putting your weathering accumulations above that. So you can now, if you're nimble enough, and it's getting more difficult with age, but as you can crawl, some of them are very small, you can crawl into these roof spaces and take samples of the wheat from those bottom layers. That's what you find. The one on the right, for example, is just a battened roof, again about 1400, from Devon. And there's rye, the original rye that was put on there, back then is just falling out of the roof space. And on the left, instead of using the battening system to support the walls, you have this waffle system here that's woven onto the roof. And the base coat beneath that was threshing waste, which of course botanically is fantastic because they were threshing, flailing away on these cereal crops. And all the weeds are there, all the ears of wheat broken off. It's just everything, insects. You name it, it's in there. I found desiccated cats, desiccated slates with witches' symbols, a few weapons. I did do a survey throughout every county in Ireland during the peace talk period. And it was one of the first projects between the two governments to communicate at a governmental level. They didn't really care about the results in a sense. It was very good. But I did survey 700 ancient thatched buildings, or oldest thatched buildings we could find throughout Ireland, which was incredible in the botanical sense. And I've got boxes and boxes of artifacts that I found out of these rooms. Anyway, I'm going on. Sometimes, instead of crawling up from the inside, sometimes a roof will need to be repaired. You can see how thick that roof is. You've got the smoke blackened base at the bottom. This was a fire, and we were able to clean off and create an archaeological section. So then you can get, I haven't got the tags in, but you can work your way up and get samples of every layer. So that's the concept. The slides aren't so great, I'm really sorry, but the wheat is extremely well preserved. It's just like modern wheat, except it's covered with soot. So the finest morphological detail of the ear survives. This is from 600 years. It's not bad. Wheat has changed more in the last 100 years I would say, than it has in the previous millennia. So it's a key into that ancient historical, collections of wheat that were grown here. Going how far back? Who knows? I mean, are there traces of gene lines from these cereals going back to the Roman period, to the prehistoric period? Why not? There's always been continuity. Never been wiped out. We have farming. There's obviously been introductions of cereals into Britain from various sources over the centuries. So we find, by and large, a mixture of bread wheat on the left, which believe me, that is a bread wheat, and it's a bit more clear in the slide on here it is, but and this one here is a rivet wheat. So this is Triticum esculum common red wheat, and that's treated in turgeon, rivet wheat as we call it, or poulard wheat. And it seems pretty clear to me from all the evidence that this rivet wheat was introduced in the Norman period. Magical wheat. And I would say, not hesitate to say, it doubled wheat yields by its introduction here. It's really well adapted to heavy, wet clay soils, of which we have a lot. And it seems to rain a lot. And it was pretty much restricted to southern England. And they grew mixtures, which is what we did expect, right? Land-raised populations. We've got immense genetic diversity within each of those species, but also an interplanted crop. So all these amazing cereals, I mean, I suppose I could have spent most of my life just analyzing that morphological variation. I did quite a bit of it for my PhD research already. And you know, every characteristic you want to look at, from the density of the ear, for example. There are rivet wheats here that aren't supposed to have evolved, according to John Percival, our wheat expert, who was writing in the 20s. I mean, we have super density of rivet wheats, genetic types that certainly haven't survived into gene banks, but they were here in our medieval fields. You often get just the rachis, because obviously thatchers don't tend to put wheat with ears or with rain in the roof, because the mice will soon get it. But actually that smoke that's rising up into the roof space is smoking it. It's keeping the insects away, it's keeping the rodents, keeping the mold away, so it's preserving it really, really well. So you do get rain. In fact, I'm probably the only person in the room, I bet I'm safe to say, who has eaten medieval grain. And I'm still here. I'm not supposed to eat the archaeological artifacts, Mark. I have a very small and exclusive club that eats ancient archaeological artifacts. I say that. I belong beyond archaeology. So you do get the ability to look at florets, how many fertile florets are on the ear. So what you can do with this is actually reconstruct, I'd say for the first time, get an accurate, independent reconstruction based on the actual evidence of a medieval field. Because otherwise you rely on manorial records, books. And manorial records are, you know, big estates, monasteries, who are writing, they only reflected about a quarter or a third of cereal output in the UK in 1400 or earlier than that. And they referred to growing pure wheat. Well, I don't think I've ever found a pure sample of wheat. They were always mazarin or mazandine mixtures of dry wheat. Because in these thatched roofs that have survived, that more reflects the type of wheat that was grown by the masses. By the, you know, you can apply it, the middle class and upper middle class of Britain at that time had these grand open hall buildings. So what we're finding in the thatch is definitely different from what we see in the manorial records, and reflects more of the you know, the bread of the pocket, the pain quotidien that everybody ate from day to day, and it was a mixture of rye and wheat. But these two types of wheat, rivet wheat and red wheat. So the rivet wheat, a number of different things came out of this. So the rivet wheat is incredibly productive and high yielding, but it was pretty much dropped around 1850, 1875. It started to disappear because it doesn't make fluffy white bread. So when you get the development of industrial baking, they focused on modern bread wheat to get the air in so they can sell you water and air and a nice big fluffy white loaf. But rivet is full of flavor. It tastes like chestnut. If anyone's had spelt wheat, it's more chestnutty than spelt wheat. It's a delicious wheat, and I've got 6 acres of it, rapidly bulking up. Because it also makes a brilliant pasta, because of the gluten tendencies, because it doesn't sweat, but it makes a beautiful pasta. So watch this space. I should have brought you some pasta to taste, but next time, now that I know how convivial the Society of Free Economic Botany to the barbecue. So we're able to get at yield, like I say, and this idea of interplanting. And of course, you interplant for obvious good reasons that we all understand. Genetic diversity gives you that resilience, that crop resilience that we need. In a period of climate change, what's going on now? I mean, I'm rapidly starting to grow whole wheats, and I'm increasing the genetic diversity of my populations because we haven't had a good season in 2 or 3 years. I'm actually, perhaps strangely, I'm planting all my winter wheat next week in July, because you can't get onto the fields in October, and you can't get onto the fields even in early spring. Planted incredibly late today. The weather's all over the place. So to have genetic diversity in your crop, as our ancestors clearly recognized and had in a sense, no choice about, as long as you keep resowing the seed from your same crop, you're going to perpetuate and increase that genetic diversity, and the heterogeneity in the fields, in ridge and furrow, English fields, encourage the retention of that. And so it was critical to that survival. There's no dole. You know, if you don't have a crop of some sort, you die, you starve. So the rivet wheat gave you this potential for high yield, and the bread wheat diversity gave you this resilience. And throw in rye, which is really good in cold weather and always gets you through, high protein, allows the bread to last longer. You've got a very resilient and productive crop. You're trading off, you know, a little bit of yield, but it's well worth it. So I won't go on, but I've looked at, measured thousands and thousands of stems to try to get some idea of how these crops were processed. This takes me back into the art of botanical work, where you can get some idea about how grain processing was done, because you find you have all the weeds, you have the actual sample. It's very difficult to go back looking at charred seeds anymore when you have the whole sheaf from the medieval period. So I've really not been doing that quite as much. There's some, well, that's the picture on the left is from Belgium in the 14th century, and the one on the right is the English version. You can see the artistic difference. My mother's from Belgium, and my father's parents were from Britain, so I always try to present both. Anyway, I thought it was very interesting to start to grow these and to taste them and to grow it. I thought maybe there's some potential in growing them. I was a wheat geek, I suppose I should say. So I was at Reading University, I started growing lots of modern ones as well as old ones, and these were marvelous wheats that grew 6 foot tall. You know, you can't put any nitrogen on the ground, of course, because they'll grow 10 foot tall and fall over. You won't have any crop at all. So the challenge to medieval farmers was to keep nitrogen levels down, which of course is completely contrary to what you think about modern farming, which is, you know, crop rotations, legumes, nitrogen. That wasn't the issue. If you grew a field of peas, for example, and you put in these very long, tall weeds, you risked losing your crop, which is an interesting change to the perceptions anyway. And this all coincided when I got more and more deeply involved in the thatching world, because thatchers are crying out for good quality straw. The quality of straw has dropped enormously in the last 50, 60 years. Partially because the legislation is always pushing for the adoption of new varieties. In Britain, we have the national list of permitted varieties, which is, you know, Brussels, EU policed. So if your wheat variety is not on the official permitted list, you can't give the seed to anyone. You can't exchange it, you can't barter it, you can't sell it. And wheat needs to be quite tall. It needs to be about 120 centimeters, let's say, to make good quality thatching straw. Well, the tallest wheat that's legal, officially permitted in Britain, is only about 80 centimeters tall, 90 centimeters if you add nitrogen, and it's Meriswigen released in the mid-60s. So since the 1960s, there hasn't been a wheat suitable for thatching roofs. I mean, historically, obviously, they used the thatch on the roof, the straw on the roof, and used the grain to make bread, whatever we want. So that hasn't been possible since the 60s. So a few farmers have kept these old varieties, but it's illegal to trade them. So I know a thatcher or a thatching straw grower who lost a good part of his crop to bad weather. But it would be illegal for him to go to his neighbor, who he gave the seed to 10 years before, growing that same old variety. It's 2 years in jail for his neighbor to give him seed to restock his farm with. I swear that's the truth. That's the plant seeds and variety. And it pertains to every crop. Tomatoes, you know, pink tomatoes, purple carrots, all that situation. And it's being tightened. So I thought, well, here's an opportunity for me to make an impact. I'm going to start growing these and giving them out to everyone. I'd love to go to jail. Street cred for my sons, and I'll eat nothing but heritage bread and water. So anyway, so it's shortened hugely to the point where the thatching straw industry is criminalized, you could say, which is insane. So the response is to import water reed from China and South Africa and Turkey and Eastern Europe. And it's poor quality water. The traditional material for thatching roofs in Britain for the past 1,000 years at least, I'm actually just writing a big report on the archaeology of it all for English heritage, has been straw, wheat straw, good quality straw. Oats, straw, and barley are too soft. Watery, if you have it, but there wasn't a lot of it around. So, you know, why are we importing it from China? Everyone perceives a thatched roof as a very eco-green roof. But if not, it's imported from China, cut by prison labor. So I always think of that fellow in front of the tank who stopped the tank with his little flags. He's cutting water reed to put on English thatched roofs. And that's wrong. And I think what we need to do is return to growing these traditional straws. So that's part of this educational message that I've been pushing at the beginning. Like, I suppose I could have spent my time behind the microscope analyzing the morphology, and it's all very interesting botanically. And when I retire, I'll go back and pull out the dust off the microscope from all its black medieval soot and start to maybe do some more botanical work on that. But I thought, well, what I can probably do to make my greatest impact is to start growing this again in quantity. And of course, to make it work, it's illegal to, of course, acquire all these. Once you have the seed, it's okay. I can grow it, I can mill it, I can use it, but it's the trafficking in old wheat, in a sense. It's more criminal than growth. It's insane. So possession is decriminalized, but trafficking is highly illegal, particularly in old wheat. So I thought, well, if I can turn it into a viable business, they'd have a lot harder time arresting me for this. So I thought, if I can create a business based on growing these old cereals and protecting this genetic legacy of our ancestors, I'm helping all these things, and you know, arrest me. So I started to work with small farmers, and there's an educational element there. How to grow these old crops is a challenge. You need low nitrogen conditions. You can't, I don't know if you can just see it, there's 5 wind turbines in the back on the horizon. A local farmer, very ecological, organic, but he still had too much manure in the field. There was still a problem with lodging, so it was still too much. I need really low nitrogen. I don't manure on my fields. I only undersow with clover, because if I manure, there's too much nitrogen. A tickle isn't going to hurt, but they really, really are responsive, because these old varieties are very quick to form associations with root fungi, with mycorrhiza, which of course, you know, quadruple your root mass and scavenge phosphorus and nitrogen really well. So I have ample, just from, as long as you have healthy soil with lots of microbes in it, that's really good. So this is the farm I'm on. We have an old Fergie tractor, or a few others. It's more like a collection of old machinery at this place. It hasn't changed since the 1930s, which is kind of like an abandoned farm. It's perfect for me. It's all the old techniques. So we harvest with thatching straw. We have a reaper binder, because you need the whole straw intact, not broken up in any way. Combine harvester would just chop it to bits, so you can't use it for thatching. So we're resurrecting all of this old kit and learning how to maintain you know, old reaper binders and old threshing machines and these sorts of things. But I also have worked with an agricultural engineer to develop some new kind of titanium alloy wheeled straw homers and different bits of appropriate safe kit that can be used on a small scale, because I wanted to try to provide a model for small scale producers. If you have 5,000 acres and you want to grow wheat, maybe you can make, if you're lucky, 50 pounds an acre, and maybe you can survive. But you can't survive on 1,000 acres, let alone 100 acres. Well, between 80 and 100 to play with. There's no way you can make money. If you make 50 pounds an acre on 100 acres, you know, that's not really a huge income. But if you can take those products and add higher value to them, so by selling bread, flour, pasta, biscuits, and thatching straw, sells for about 1,400 pounds, British pounds per acre. Well, organic grain sells for 350 pounds per pound. So it's 3 times the selling price, the straw, than the grain. So I thought, if I could do 40, 50 acres, I think I can probably make this work. And in that whole story, I was helped by, there was a European grant available to get some interesting equipment, but also the Prince of Wales got very, very interested in this, thank goodness. And so we got the first slice of the Prince's Countryside Fund, which is for interesting diversification of and interesting agricultural projects. So he was very generous to us. Anyway, after you cut the thatching straw, you scoop it up in the field. So I thought, well, I want to produce a crop, again, that's very tall, that's very resilient, like I said. So I went to all the gene banks I could think of, and I had my own collections of cereals, and I worked in Turkey and collected wheat there, in this field marsh. All sorts of wheat from dried flour displays, you name it. I've got wheat from everywhere. And my point was to recreate the broadest genetic population of cereals I could find. Now, I know that population has shrunk over the years. You know, in the first couple of years, I'm sure I lost 30, 40% of that diversity, because they just weren't suited, they just weren't adapted. But that's okay. The ones that were left are adapted and are growing well. And they're producing really good thatching straw, but also really good quality flour. So that was my mix of mostly bread wheats. The problem with mixing it with rivet wheat is rivet wheat, at least this variety of rivet wheat, and we have very few, I think, surviving from that pool of variety from the past, but they're quite late to ripen. So this can ripen into September, October, whereas the others ripen a good 6 weeks earlier. So that's fine if you're cutting with wheat binder, because you put the wheat up in the field and it dries for 3 weeks in the field and everything's fine and dry by the time you thresh it and use it for bread. But if you're using a combine, you'll get green grain of rivet wheat stuck in with the dry grain. So that whole change in harvesting method has changed the dynamics of the population. Anyway, very interesting wheat, this fascinating wheat. Spelt wheat, which you'll have heard about. Of course, the problem is a lot of modern spelt. People say, is spelt, oh, you grow spelt, it's a heritage grain. Well, I do, but I try to grow pure spelt. But the problem is so many spelt varieties have been hybridized very directly with modern bread wheat. So there's all these myths about spelt. Oh, it's easier to digest, it's not even a wheat. All this stuff on the web, don't believe half of it, or 3/4 of it. It clearly is a wheat, and it's clearly full of gluten, and it's so close. I just refer to it more like a bread wheat dressed up like spelt. And of course, they've shortened it hugely, increased the yield. True spelt wheats are very low yielding. They do have a lovely flavor, but they aren't fluffy and white like you have modern spelts. It's not quite the real McCoy. So this whole issue of what is a heritage cereal, I'm hoping this summer to very much clarify, because we've now hired a web design company, because I want to just do the field and not do all that webby stuff. Twitter or Facebook, I don't. Oh, okay, anyway. Emmer wheat makes a fantastic pasta. Time is flying by. I'm really enjoying myself, that's right. This is an active windmill, and it's just missing his head. You see his hair is blowing to the right. So I've worked with millers and bakers to produce artisan, sourdough bread. We launched a line of flour. This was a bread co-op that we set up in Oxford. But we discovered then the baker was mixing in high gluten flour, and it was not what we wanted. Beautiful pasta. We have open days, harvest festivals, where all the people can come and help stoop and harvest, and they buy into the concept of it, because they really want to know where the bread's coming from. And so we run bread baking courses. I have a really good French baker who's giving courses. This was taken just 2 days ago before I came here. We're doing a lot of educational projects with children now. This is pizza making. But the beauty is you're on the farm. You've made pizza dough from the flour you've grown from these heritage cereals. And all the other ingredients are grown in, well, tomatoes you need polytunnels, but the idea is you grow it all on the farm. There's pigs, and we're using all the ham from the farm. And the children are really, really interested in that. And they've never been to a farm. The kids come from London, and what's a cow? A little boy the other day said to the woman on the farm, they said, well, where do you get your McDonald's burger? He said, oh, well, you cut it off the side of the cow, and then it grows back. That is the concept. So it's, you have to kill a cow? Oh, that's horrible. No, we can't do that. But that's the thing. So when you think about wheat, they say, what? What's wheat? I have no idea what wheat is. So, I give them porridge and we give them all these things. So they get it. And I'm working a lot with smallholders. I'm a mad siler myself. And there are a lot of people who are moving onto the land. There seems to be a whole new movement to do that, taking over small plots. And they all want to grow wheat on a small scale. But it's a chore to grow more than a quarter acre or half an acre on your own. However, so we've been developing cradles for the sod. That cradle is never really used in Britain. It's very much a North American thing. But it's a great exercise. You should all join the Siding Association. So we have siding days where we try to, and sickling days. So, ending with this, so we have this immense genetic diversity from the past. We've lost a lot, but if you tap into the gene banks and all these other things, that diversity is still there. And I feel responsible. We're responsible, as while we're all here, to spread that, to perpetuate that diversity into the future. I think one of the best ways of doing that is through our bellies. People will respond to that. And if you can make it marketable, and people are buying not just a product, they're buying a story. That's what they want. They want decent bread. People are fed up with fluffy white bread. That gives you celiac disease and gluten intolerance, because it's made in what the Chorley wood process now takes 28 minutes, I think, to make a loaf of bread from the beginning until it's sliced and cooled. It's like a 7-minute ferment. Well, we're eating undigested starch. No wonder we have celiac disease and gluten intolerance and all the other problems. We're not designed to eat raw starch. Fermentation is a natural of bread, is pre-digestion. So I think people are beginning to wake up to that, and they want to buy a decent loaf that's going to be healthy for their children, for themselves, and they want to know where it comes from. So they come to the farm and they can see that. So that's my attempt to bridge the gap between academe and the people.